Hello, everyone. I'm John O'Loughlin. Welcome to McDuff Lives. And today we are finally inaugurating my investigation into a Substack by a man who goes by escapekey. His work is really astounding, and I'm delighted to be sharing some of it this morning, particularly his four-part series, Inaugurated in Dallas, which proposes that the assassination of President Kennedy is the beginning of the global governance that we are facing today. I think it's a darn sound argument, and I'm going to be exploring it with you as we read, with my usual comments from his Substack entitled Inaugurated in Dallas. So let's get started. All right, and thanks for being with me here at McDuff Lives. I'm John O'Loughlin, and this is our series called Undo the Coup, meaning, of course, the coup d'etat that killed President Kennedy and became a new form of government over us, the citizens of the United States. Have we been robbed? Yes, we've been robbed of our constitutional rights, of our Constitution and our constitutional government, and they've been running it ever since they killed Mr. President Kennedy. So I want to turn to a very, very important thinker who goes by the name of escapekey. He has a Substack, and I'm going to say he's anonymous. He doesn't give out his name, so I'm just going to say he. Also, his main full title is The Price of Liberty is Eternal Vigilance. Who could disagree with that? And yet, our government seems to be dedicated to the proposition that we're too stupid. We'll never figure it out, and they can just keep doing as they wish to. All right, let me turn to Inaugurated in Dallas by escapekey, and I'm going to share it with you, with the screen with you, so you can read along or check it out later if you'd like to. Of course, this is a subscription that I have paid for, and I wanted to say to escapekey, if you don't approve of my work, please let me know. I'll take it right down, but I'm hoping to expand your reach as far as I can because I think your work is essential. If you had told me only a few years ago that JFK's assassination led to contemporary global governance, I would have thought you were crazy. But I suppose that's half the battle, because it's not as far-fetched as it first seems. Let's begin with a recap. John F. Kennedy's administration marked the last serious resistance to the institutionalization of technocratic governance. McNamara introduced, that's his Secretary Robert McNamara, the Secretary of Defense, introduced the Planning, Programming, Budgeting System, PPBS, at the Pentagon in 1961. But Kennedy quickly grew skeptical of its computational logic, especially after the Cuban Missile Crisis exposed the risks of rigid modeling in nuclear scenarios. He halted its expansion beyond defense while firing the top brass of the CIA who deliberated its implementation. This throttled Schlesinger's ambitions, arresting the development of the socialist, quote, Democratic International, unquote, initiative, the World Congress for Freedom and Democracy, supported by the dismissed CIA Director of Intelligence, Robert Amory Jr. All right, let me take a moment on Robert Amory Jr. Robert Amory Jr. comes from the New England, Massachusetts Blue Bloods. His younger brother is Cleveland Amory, the famous writer, and advocate for neutering pets. And I wanted to give a hat tip to our friend Bill Taylor, who has pointed to Robert Amory Jr. For a number of years now as a very important but little mentioned figure, the fourth man that was fired by JFK as a result of the Bay of Pigs. Robert Amory's brief was bean counting. He was the person that put together all of the estimates and suggestions for how to make the Bay of Pigs work. And he is the man who has been proposing various types of government from behind the scenes in his capacity as a CIA leader. He was the deputy director for intelligence for a number of years. Then and he doesn't admit that he was fired. He says that he decided to change jobs. Where did he go? He went to the Bureau of the Budget. The Bureau of the Budget, where he worked, then got jurisdiction over all of the money that was being doled out to places like USAID, one of the primary vehicles for imposing this world governance that we're now trying to fight our way out of. So I'm going to go to part 1 of the 4 parts and start there. Inaugurated in Dallas, part 1. Let me check and make sure you can see it. Yes, you can. And all right, ready to go. There are moments in history which, when viewed in the light of decades, not years, reveal themselves as decisive inflection points. The assassination of John F. Kennedy was one such, a moment that arrested not just a presidency, but an ideological resistance to the rise of technocratic control. Okay? And you guys know what technocratic control, it comes from the idea of a technate. A technate here, the AI version. A technate is a concept for a future society or superstate governed by technical experts, technocrats using scientific principles, proposed by the 1930s technocracy movement, aiming to manage resources efficiently through energy accounting instead of money. Energy accounting, okay? Carbon tax. Abolishing politics for a single North American entity, the US, Canada, Greenland, and parts of Central America, focused on abundance via automation and engineering, with ideas seeing modern echoes in discussions about tech influence on government. And let's see, can you see this? I'm going to put this map up here so you can see it. It's on the meme on the beginning of the show there, but let me put up another one. Because I think this picture is really quite important. I'll get it in a second. All right, this is the Google page, and you can see over on the right side of it a red colored landmass, which includes, guess what? Venezuela. Hello? Anybody interested in Venezuela today? Greenland. Anybody been interested in Greenland in the past year or so? Mexico, Central America, of course, all included, and Canada and Alaska, of course. So this is, well, one way to put it is one of the 3 powers in the 1984 by Orwell. It is also just the idea of organizing things by continent is a mark of efficiency that they sought after. Well, technocracy comes from the 1920s and 30s, and guess whose grandmother or grandparent, I can't remember which, was one of the founders of the movement? Elon Musk. Okay. So if that doesn't create at least three powerful resonances as to what's going on today, I don't know what will. All right, let me get rid of this and we'll bring back. Sorry. Bring back the text from the Substack of escapekey. Okay, the assassination of Kennedy arrested not just a presidency, but an ideological resistance to the rise of technocratic control. And this new post-assassination trajectory might well have led to the development of the seventh floor shadow state. John F. Kennedy entered office with a mix of Cold War realism, liberal idealism, and Council of Foreign Relations representation. Among his cabinet was Robert McNamara, a CFR member, and former Ford Motor Company executive who became Secretary of Defense. Almost immediately, McNamara set out to implement a planning, programming, and budgeting system, the PPBS, across the Department of Defense. PPBS was designed to track every stage of a process by tracking both numerical inputs and measurable outputs, creating a feedback loop to evaluate efficiency in terms of goal delivery. That's cold and frightening language that leads us to the Phoenix program, folks. In essence, PPBS kept a tight leash on metrics. Outputs were no longer vague deliverables. They were precise, trackable, and reproducible. And because of this, each output could now serve as the input for the next stage, and operations could be sequenced into a continuous chain of feedback and correction. This enabled, theoretically, a form of long-term planning grounded not in abstract projections, but in real-time system performance, backed by detailed tracing of the delivery of objectives. What consequently began as a defense budgeting method would soon become the model for technocratic governance at scale. The CIA was next in line for full PPBS rollout, but then disaster struck. The Bay of Pigs invasion was a total failure, and in the aftermath, John F. Kennedy purged the top leadership of the agency. Among the 4 senior officials removed was Robert Amory Jr., a key figure in introducing systems-based planning to intelligence, though his role often escapes notice. Arthur Schlesinger Jr. protested, attempting to protect Amory, but his objections were in vain, with Amory being let go on the 15th of April, 1962. This almost certainly was not according to plan, as the two men also had cooperated on a World Congress for Freedom and Democracy, likely a manipulative attempt at reframing liberal Western democracy around stakeholder governance. Okay. However, despite the early promise of McNamara's PPBS, JFK's faith in the system began to erode during the Cuban Missile Crisis. At a critical juncture, McNamara's much vaunted Wonder system recommended a series of precision strikes on Soviet missile installations in Cuba. But Kennedy hesitated, and rightly so. As later revealed, the Department of Defense lacked the full intelligence picture, and such strikes would likely have triggered massive Soviet retaliation. That moment proved decisive. JFK came to understand the limits of systems analysis, its reliance on incomplete data, and its preference for computational modeling over political deliberation. And from that point forward, he began to distance himself from the broader rollout of systems theory within government. Kennedy's foreign policy increasingly diverged from the hard-edged interventionism favored by key people in the Defense Department and the CIA. His 1961 fallout with the agency following the Bay of Pigs, culminating in the dismissal of Allen Dulles, Charles Cabell, Richard Bissell, and Robert Amory Jr., reflected more than operational failure. It marked a philosophical shift. While Kennedy did not reject data-driven planning outright, he did, after all, retain McNamara. He became increasingly resistant to the wholesale integration of these methods across the federal government. For Kennedy, politics was not reducible to computational modeling, but an endeavor grounded in human judgment, intuition, and contextual deliberation, a stance that placed him in growing tension with the logic of post-war technocracy. Kennedy's National Security Action Memoranda from 1962 to 63, particularly NSAMs 55 to 57, and the later NSAM 263, the Vietnam Withdrawal Plan, signaled a clear shift toward reducing covert influence. As you know, NSAM 55 and 57 are the national security memoranda that led to the creation of SACSA, which is the subject of many of my shows, where my dad spent his last 10 years working for SACSA under the Joint Chiefs of Staff in the Pentagon. So the same operative memoranda, 55, 57. And then if you follow our show at all, you know 263 was the withdrawal plan. Equally revealing was the rejection of proposals like the World Congress for Freedom and Democracy, backed by Arthur Schlesinger Jr. and Robert Amory Jr., which would have established a supranational trisectoral civic management infrastructure modeled on civil society capture and, quote, expert-led consensus mechanisms, well outside of democratic capacity. Okay. Arthur Schlesinger Jr., a famous memo recently released in May of this year, 2025, was one of the people that identified this blob that we call it now, the deep state, the secret government operating within the CIA. And by calling that out back in 1960 something, I don't know, 63 or 4, he became a hero to a lot of people because, wow, here is Schlesinger saying no to the expansion of the CIA's power, and yes to Kennedy's effort to either destroy or divide up the CIA into a number of parts that could be individually controlled. Well, Schlesinger wanted to divide the CIA into two basic parts, and one of those parts would have been run by Robert Amory Jr., and that part would be the collection of data, the photo reconnaissance being done then by satellites as well as by U-2s, etc., and the amassing of all the possible data that they could grab in order to make policy recommendations. And that is the technocratic state in embryo that Kennedy stopped or tried to stop. Kennedy recognized the dangers of elite-managed internationalism cloaked in democratic rhetoric. In that light, it's especially telling that he had Robert Amory Jr. bugged in February 1963, a highly unusual move made all the more striking by the fact that Kennedy expressed personal interest in the case. Oh. I beg your pardon. Now, we've talked about this on my Twitter feed, on my X feed. It's in fact a rather remarkable thing that I'll make it bigger here. February 11th, 1963, memorandum for the Attorney General referenced Robert Amory Jr. Robert Amory Jr. of the Bureau of the Budget, Washington, D.C., has been in close association with a member of the Yugoslav intelligence service, and that Yugoslav intelligence is desirous of reestablishing contact. To secure from Robert Amory data available to him by virtue of his high position in the United States government. Okay, Yugoslavia, communists, Amory's sharing data with the communists, call the FBI. Well, nothing came of it, but that is what must have been generated by President Kennedy when he wanted to get Amory checked out. Under Lyndon B. Johnson, the PPBS system, previously confined to McNamara's Defense Department, was extended to all executive agencies in 1965. Well, there it is. Kennedy did not want this PPBS, whereas Lyndon Johnson imposed it on the entire government. Where Kennedy had approached central planning with caution, Johnson embraced it with enthusiasm. Systems analysis became the common language of federal administration, embedding rationalized, metric-driven oversight into domains such as education, health, welfare, and environmental policy. What drew less public attention, however, was a flurry of executive orders issued shortly after the escalation of the Vietnam War during Johnson's second term. In hindsight, these are remarkable, as they granted the Federal Reserve unprecedented visibility into the financial flows of the nation's largest banks. Behind the scenes, monetary authorities were quietly gaining structural oversight that would lay the groundwork for deeper integration between fiscal policy, banking, and national planning. And I don't want anybody to miss the point here. When we're talking about central planning, we're talking about a communist system. The latter point becomes especially significant in light of a controversial document previously discussed in the Substack Silent Weapons for Quiet Wars. That text outlines a methodology for economically shocking the American population and then measuring the reverberations through the economy, a concept that aligns suspiciously well with the dynamics of the 1973 oil shock. Yes, we've read about this elsewhere, the 1973 Kissinger oil shock, which created an amazing amount of inflation. Interest rates went crazy. And, we had lines at the gas stations. That was a shock to us. And was it a planned shock so that they could then take advantage of their access to all the metrics that they had just given to the Federal Reserve to see how that financial shock reverberates? In other words, kind of testing the resilience of our economy. But there's a deeper problem at play. Such economic reverberations could not have been tracked or modeled with any precision unless the authors had access to real time, granular fiscal flow data, precisely the kind of access enabled by the executive orders issued under LBJ. These orders furnished the Federal Reserve with an unprecedented window into the operations of major U.S. banks, creating the infrastructure for what we might now call economic telemetry. And this then hints at what would have been would have even been capable of discussing such a topic in the first place, and who would have been capable of discussing the topic in the first place. Answer: those with operational control over the Federal Reserve. Well, we know who those are. Those are the main trustees of the New York Fed, J.P. Morgan, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Soon after LBJ came to power, he reversed JFK's withdrawal from Vietnam in NSAM 263 through NSAM 288, and also leaned heavily on people like Walt Rostow, a promoter of modernization theory and centralized economic planning, to shape U.S. development strategy abroad. Domestically, Johnson's Great Society initiatives expanded federal insight into civil life, especially given initiatives such as his war on poverty, addressed by and large through statistical indicators. In fact, much of the Great Society's implementation relied on indicators generated through surveillance data and computational forecasting, precisely the kinds of instruments made possible by the broad rollout of PPBS across government agencies. In parallel, it quietly normalized the increasing presence of the third party expert mediator, technocrats, consultants, and data analysts, into the core of governance, and thus entirely outside the scope of democracy. The technocratic architecture was being constructed under the banner of compassion and social justice, with surveillance driven data systems used to determine which populations were deserving of intervention or financial aid. In effect, ethics and empathy were operationalized through metrics, and the groundwork was laid for a model of governance that would become increasingly algorithmic and managerial in the decades to come. Need we say algorithm ghetto? And as McNamara left the Department of Defense, his next position with the World Bank proved yet another opportunity for the integration of PPBS, but this time slowly rolled out through its sister agencies such as UNIDO, and the UNDP in the early 70s, while the 23rd May 1972 agreement quietly fused socialism and capitalism under the environment-based indicator created through UNEP GEMS surveillance data and modeled by the IIASA. Okay, the IIASA is the International Institute for Applied Systems Analysis. Okay, systems analysis, that's what we're talking about. A dull, gray, boring word which cloaks behind it the whole power of technocracy and the government by technocracy. Experts, consultants, statisticians. And the GEMS he's done a whole Substack on that, the Global Environmental Monitoring System. And, using environmental monitoring to create statistics that can then be used to achieve goals is exactly what they did in order to continue their eugenics program under another name. And escapekey has documented this in a number of fantastic articles that I say, open up escapekey.substack.com and start reading articles. You'll be very enlightened and very amazed at how well this person has put it all together. I am very grateful that he's done so. By the 1980s, the core mechanisms of PPBS were integrated into the emerging framework of New Public Management, NPM. A pivotal moment came in 1984 with the publication of R. Edward Freeman's stakeholder approach, which provided the ideological background for a shift in public administration. Under NPM, performance targets and quasi-market mechanisms were introduced into the public sector. Agencies were now expected to compete and were rewarded or penalized based on key performance indicators, KPIs, of course. Governance was reframed in managerial terms. Efficiency, responsiveness, and stakeholder satisfaction replaced deliberation, public accountability, and civic judgment. And not least through McNamara's World Bank, this system was increasingly introduced globally. This evolution continued with the rise of results-based management, RBM, a framework that evaluated entire institutions based on their alignment with predefined goals. Major global organizations, including the United Nations and the World Bank, adopted RBM to manage complex partnerships by tracking progress toward specific targets, such as the Millennium Development Goals, the MDGs, and later, the Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs, which we talked about so much in the past years on his show here. This is the Klaus Schwab World Economic Forum Sustainable Development. You will own nothing and you'll be happy, but maybe not for long. But this same mechanism also found domestic application, notably in Tony Blair's 1998 Fabian Society pamphlet, The Third Way. I'm going to stop and say I think he's given away the fact that he's British and not American. He spelled defense with a C. So I think our author is in fact probably British. Notably in Tony Blair's 1998 Fabian Society. Well, the Fabian Society is all about this, folks. It's all about the development of an elite class of super people that run everything and a lower class of dumb, short, ignorant people that probably do a little bit of the work, but are basically permitted to live like farm animals by the elites. The third way, Blair proposed that local councils be assigned specific targets with performance measured against those goals. Failure to meet these could result in financial penalties, effectively placing councilors in a fiscal straitjacket. Comply with the centrally defined objectives, or explain to residents why services like elderly care or policing had to be cut. Post-Blair, Gordon Brown frequently invoked the idea of the good society, a concept that echoed Lyndon Johnson's Great Society, but now updated with more advanced computational tools. Like its predecessor, Brown's vision relied heavily on indicator-based governance, enabled by systemic surveillance and predictive modeling. What had once been long-range planning through bureaucratic systems was now being carried out by data-driven algorithms, offering the appearance of moral progress while deepening technocratic control. The appearance of moral progress while deepening technocratic control. This gave rise to what can be best described as target-based governance, an indicators regime, where measurable indicators are no longer just tools for evaluation, but become instruments of governance themselves. Systems such as the SDGs, ESGs, and HDI function through indicators as input data for cybernetic feedback loops, actively shaping policy, finance, and public narrative. The alignment with contemporary policy, particularly in areas like climate action, sustainability, and biodiversity, should now be unmistakably clear. Governance will increasingly be executed not through law or deliberation, but through metrics. The culmination of this entire trajectory is digital twin simulation governance, powered by advanced AI. This model enables real-time adjustment of systems through global surveillance, artificial intelligence, and indicator-based targets that determine whether a decision is considered, quote, ethical, unquote, or not. Where this determination is made relative to a stated objective. If an action aids in the delivery of a set objective, then it, per definition, is ethical. Much like Paul Carus in 1893 first stated that, quote, truth, accordingly, is a description of existence under the aspect of eternity. These ethical determinations are then filtered through a cultural framework integrated into education, the arts, science, and even religion. At the philosophical root lies Hermann Cohen, whose notion of infinite judgment justifies the codification of ethics into binding legislation, a mechanism historically associated with systemic abuses committed under the banner of moral necessity. Yet, at its core, this system marks a shift from static planning to dynamic, cybernetic management of ecosystems, economies, and societies, governed not by law or democracy, but by feedback, simulation, and code, which I previously labeled cybernetic Thomism. This development, which fused with AI, leads directly into what I previously called cybernetic imperialism, a system in which AI doesn't merely respond to human input, but actively tailors the returned information to the individual, with an example presented below, which outlines various ChatGPT summaries of a Substack post as though it were published by a number of different news media, thus illustrating how incredibly manipulative this technology can truly be. And though this rests under the banner of AI ethics and safety, it eventually evolves into something far more sinister, the integration of man and machine through brain-computer interfaces, a stage that Huxley and others foresaw and named transhumanism. Ergo, what began with McNamara's early-stage predictability, the chaining of processes for long-term planning, gradually became continuous, global, automated, and ethical, quote-unquote. It evolved into target-based accounting, outcome-based accountability, strategic foresight, and eventually into the framework now known as Earth Systems Governance, a model of infinite complexity-based feedback for climate, biodiversity, and even human health. And all this sprang to life under the banner of Spaceship Earth in the mid-1960s with the 1968 UNESCO Biosphere Conference indicating a sharp acceleration of this initiative. Alongside this came management information systems, the transformation of global surveillance into normalized indicators, the rise of planetary monitoring platforms, and the deployment of AI simulation models, not just to observe, but to predict and correct. These models inform adaptive management, where outputs are continually adjusted in real time to maintain system equilibrium. Consequently, McNamara's budget focus was never just about money. It became policy plus ethics plus data stitched together in a global feedback infrastructure designed not to govern by law, but to manage by simulation. In other words, the trajectory has always been clear: a progressively tighter coupling between systems theory, moral governance, and technological convergence. And there was really only one man that took a stand against this development. That same man who was assassinated in Dallas in November of 1963. So, do you have a digital twin? You do. You probably do. Do I have one? I'm fairly certain I do. Remember Joseph Conrad's book, The Doppelganger? You know, the guy that is in the shadows, follows you around, but you never meet him, you never get to interact. The digital twin created by data centers. Why do they need so many data centers? Because they want to make sure that they have a digital twin for every person, every institution, every building, every process, every corporation, everything is going to be put into the big computers so that they can run simulations in real time. Why? Well, to make sure that we stay within bounds, that we don't do things that are, quote, unethical according to the decisions made by this computer generated algorithm. In order to, without any conscientious pangs whatsoever, throw somebody into the algorithm ghetto that Hervoye Moritz talked about so passionately in our last show, where you can't get to your bank account, you can't open the security lock on your apartment, you can't travel, you can't buy a bus ticket, you can't do anything because you have been thrown out of the system by the algorithm. And there's no court that's going to reverse that, because all of this happens above and beyond the field of democracy, above and beyond the idea of constitutional government. It's not government by law anymore. It's not government by deliberation anymore. It's not government by civic duty anymore, if we ever had it. No, it's all going to be created in a computer. And whatever you want to do, you better make sure that it's okay with your digital twin. So there you have it. That's my introduction to escapekey's very valuable work. I, he has 4 parts to his essay, Inaugurated in Dallas, and I have read all of them, and I can highly recommend them all to you. President Kennedy stood not only against the expansion of CIA power militarily, he stood against the expansion of the technocracy that was being pushed all around him by the CFR, by the Skull and Bones people, by the people from the Boston Brahmins, by people who are already convinced that they belong to this elite class, and their job is just to figure out how to manage the rest of us without getting themselves killed. Well, they had to get rid of President Kennedy in order to do it. And I want to emphasize something here. I'm not saying that this was the sole reason for Kennedy's assassination, but the Kennedy assassination becomes awfully darn convenient, does it not, to these technocrats who ended up using Johnson to just sign off on all of the things that they wanted. And it conveniently goes along with Johnson's own personal ambition to be the president and hatred of the Kennedys. And so, can one say LBJ did it? Or perhaps one could say some powers behind the scenes whispered in LBJ's ears and said, you know, if you do this, you'll be king of the universe. You'll be able to have all the women and all the riches and all the gold and everything you want. The Faustian bargain. And he took it. We may never sort the bottom out down to the bottom of exactly who started the ball rolling, but we have an awful lot of concurrent interests that come together into an assassination plot that was executed on November 22nd, 1963, killing not only the president, but the republic that he loved so much and asked us to serve. Thank you very much. I will see you tomorrow with our good friend David Cranmer Underdown, who'll be back for a kind of a year-end show with me. I always enjoy it. Hope you can join us then. Bye now.